QSO Today, episode 530, Jack Schuster, W1WEF. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. My sincere thanks to all of you who continue to support the QSO Today podcast, even during my extended absence due to illness. Please follow the link on the show notes page to the subscriber and donation listings. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I was a guest on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, episode 244 last week, where I got to tell some stories and share what's on my workbench. I had a great time. There is a link to this episode in this week's show notes page. I picked up a new ICOM 7300 and have been experimenting with the digital modes, including FT8 and Vera AC. Look for me on 20 and 17 meters. It's great to have the waterfall display back and the features of the 7300 in my shack. I'm also using the N3FJP logging software that updates my QRZ logbook as well, so you can see my on-air activity in real time. And I must say, it's just great to be back on the air. Please update my ham radio events calendar with your event. The idea was to centralize or at least have a ham radio calendar for planning future ham radio get-togethers. There is a banner link in the show notes page to adding your event to this calendar. If you're new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Jack Schuster, W1WEF, may be one of the longest-running contesters to date, beginning with sweepstakes in 1952. Jack has operated many CW and single-sideband contests since then, even operating from Curacao more than 10 times in as many years, taking first place in the ARRL DX CW 2 and 3 times. With over 70 years of amateur radio experience, it's great to hear Jack's perspective in this QSO Today. W1WEF, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jack?
4Z1UG, W1WEF. Nice to meet you, Eric.
Nice to meet you, Jack. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started before I ever heard of ham radio. For my 10th birthday, I received a crystal set kit for which I had to wind the coil with enameled copper wire, then clean off a strip on the coil so a contact could be made, and I could tune stations in the slider along that coil. And the kit included a pair of headphones, a galena crystal. I put it together at 10 years old, and I can remember the box that it came in. It had a picture on the cover of a boy with headphones on saying, "Oh boy, it works," but it didn't work.
Oh, it didn't work.
No, it didn't work for me.
What did you find that was the problem? Was it scraping off all of the resin on top of the wire on the coil?
No, I was going to get to that later, but I met another friend who became my friend who had experience with crystal sets, and he got it to work because, and this was a few years later when I dug it out again, this crystal set had a galena crystal and a cat whisker, and you had to find a spot on the galena where you made a semiconductor that was a detector. And we never realized how sensitive it was and how you had to find the exact right spot for it to work. So once I realized that, I could do it, and I could get the 50,000 watt station that was about a mile away.
And what was the cat whisker? As I recall, it was like a piece of like steel, like from a wire brush, something like that?
Well, it was more like brass with a pointed piece of brass, well, brass wire really. And there was a little holder that allowed you to move it around on the galena.
I also saw that you could also make the semiconductor from, I think it was putting a little ash on a razor blade.
Yeah, I always heard that, but I could never believe that.
That actually happened, yeah.
With all the trouble that I had with the galena. So anyway, I put that crystal set aside and I discovered one-tube radios and started building one-tube radios in the next couple of years. And there were a lot of articles published in those days for different designs that were all basically the same but used a different tube. And this tube is hotter than that one. And so I built several one-tube radios. I even built a cabinet for one, I remember.
What was your source of parts, Jack? Where were you getting parts for your one-tube radios?
Well, conveniently, my father had a radio store. He took a self-study course from National Radio Institute and decided to open his own business servicing radios. In those days, radios were unreliable and every single part in them could fail. And there were radio stores all over the place and there were part suppliers all over the place. And I had a paper route. I can remember I had 86 customers and I think I made $5 a week, saved my money up, and I could buy parts that I needed. So, and my father taught me how to solder and he encouraged me, but he didn't like the fact that I was spending so much time down in the cellar where I had my little workbench and did all my building.
I was going to ask, what was the hometown?
Springfield, Mass. So I graduated from one-tube radios to five-tube All-American Series radios. There was a place in town that sold a kit to build a five-tube radio. And after I built the first one, I built several more of them with all the same schematic. All of the radios in that time were practically the same with the All-American Tube Series. And so I built a few more radios, and then I started building other electronic things like something that was called a phono oscillator. It was supposed to be to allow you to play a phonograph into your radio on AM. But I hooked up a mic and I could broadcast to the whole neighborhood, and all the other kids could listen or be on the air. So I started off in broadcast radio, you might say.
Well, that's very cool. Now, it's my understanding that these one-tube and even the five-tube All-American radios, they didn't have power transformers, right? They actually, you put the heaters in series and maybe even the chassis was hot.
Yeah, that's true of the five-tube radios. But on the one-tube radio, I initially used batteries, like a 1.5-volt battery for filament voltage and the 67-volt battery. I think it was 67.5 volts for B+. But the last one I built used a 6BN6, I remember. And that had a 6-volt filament. I built a power supply for that. And I can remember staying up in the middle of the night listening to DX broadcast stations across the country. I never really heard real DX like we hear on the ham bands. So anyway, a few years went by. I went through Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts, and I met this friend who was the expert on crystal sets, and he informed me about ham radio and got me interested in ham radio while we were working on the radio merit badge and learning CW and studying for a second-class license. While we were in the middle of studying for the second-class license, the novice license was announced. They would start offering a novice license, and there would be a ham fest in Springfield where we could take the test. So we switched our studies to the novice class license, and I became WN1WEF, and he was WN1WEN. Then later on in school, I met WN1WEO. That's how I started in ham radio.
And how old were you when you got your first license?
It was in 1952, so I think I was about 14. after getting my license, or while waiting for my license, I started building my first transmitter. It was a 6AG7 crystal oscillator with a pi network, as I've heard others in your podcast had used. It was from the ARRL handbook. And in those days, you had to log. Well, after my license came, I could get on the air with it. And I needed a receiver first. So my dad bought me a Helicrafters S40B, and I could get on the air with a wire out of my bedroom window to a tree that was probably 50 feet away at the most. And it was just a single end-fed wire going to the Pi network. And, that transmitter was where I learned what RF burns smelled like and what it felt like to get across the cathode key hand key and get a shock. But in those days, you had to log every time you got on the air. If you called CQ and got no answer, you had to log it. So my first logbook is full of CQs with no answer, CQ, no answer. Finally, by some miracle, after 2 weeks, a VE1 came back to me. I was on 80 meters. In my novice days, I only operated on 80 meters. I had 2 crystals. And after I worked the VE1, I started working other stations, 1 or 2 of which I still work today. In the next 6 months, I managed to upgrade to general class. And then after that, I don't remember exactly how long, but I got a better receiver, an HRO5, which I bought from a neighbor of mine. He happened to be W1WEF, and he had an antenna running off of his lot through an empty lot towards my house, and the end of his antenna was probably 100 feet away from me when I was in my shack. But if anyone asked me if I had an Elmer, they weren't. I didn't think of them as an Elmer. I thought of them as Roger. I could, if I had any questions about ham radio, I could walk over to the next street, and he was very accommodating and a pretty sharp guy. I remember when single sideband first came out, he built his own sideband transmitter, sideband. So with that HRO5, it was a much better receiver than S40B. And I got interested in traffic handling on CW, checked into the Western Mass Net whenever I could, met a bunch of hams through that. And I moved on to the first regional net, which covered all of New England. I would take messages from Western Mass to the first regional net, and they would be distributed. I would pass them to hams in other parts of New England. If they were going beyond New England, they went to the Eastern area net, and that covered the whole East Coast. And they went from Eastern area net to somewhere else. They went to the Central area net via the Continental Core. Well, I moved up through traffic handling to become net control of Eastern area net, and also a member of the Transcontinental Core. And I was still doing this with a random wire antenna, although it became a little longer when I moved my shack down to the basement from my upstairs bedroom. It was still an end-fed wire. And at that time, when I was Eastern area net control, I already had built several 813 amplifiers. Probably was running about 500 watts. And I got out really well from that location. And Roger W1WEF told me there was something magic about that location. He was one of the top contesters in the day, and he had a pretty simple station. He had a beam of some kind and that wire antenna that ran towards my shack, but he did really well in contests. And we were in what was known as the Connecticut River Valley, and it was a good location. But during my days before college and still in Springfield, I operated mainly handling traffic and rag chewing also. I like to rag chew. I still like to rag chew today if I can find anyone to rag chew with on CW. And I still love CW, but I can tell you what my first phone contact was. It was with Roger. with his antenna so close to me. He was on sideband, and I learned to tune in sideband with the BFO on my HRO 5. And I called him using my Heathkit grid meter and shouting at, I just shouted at the coil, and he copied me. So I was on phone now, but eventually I built a modulator of some kind and got on phone, but I still enjoyed CW more than phone.
Jack, were you using a bug or something like that when you were doing traffic handling, or were you doing it all straight key?
No, I had graduated to a bug. Right now, I probably couldn't use a bug because after I went to a paddle and an electronic keyer, to go back to a bug, I never put a lot of effort into it. But when I've tried it once in a while, it was so, I'd be waiting for the dashes to come and they never come.
Were there any electronic keys in those days?
Not yet in those days. Before I went to college in 55, there was no such thing as an electronic keyer. When I went to college, I partly majored in ham radio. I was president of the ham club at University of Massachusetts. We had a pretty good station, and I spent too much time there. I became interested in contesting. At the Dayton Hamvention, which I've gone to every year, by the way, since 1978, missing only one, and I'm looking forward to going again next year. I've already got my hotel reserved. At the contest dinner a few years ago, they surveyed, John Doerr, the MC, surveyed the people there to find out who was in contesting the longest. And guess who it was?
That was you.
It was me. It's been 73 years now I've been a ham. And I just guessed that in my first year, 1952, that I got into some contest. I don't remember when the novice roundup even started or if I was in it for sure, but I was in sweepstakes, it turns out, in 52. And I found that out by looking through some old QSL cards that I had at one time. And I had a QSL from W1NY with a 1-cent stamp on it, dated January 1953. And it said, "Thank you for the sweepstakes contact," which would have been in November of 52. So now I knew I really was the oldest ham there, because there was one other guy who stood up, and John recognized him before he saw that I was still standing. And that was N6TJ, Jim Niger, who it turned out didn't have as many years as I did. Well, he was short by 1 year. So I did, after that sweepstakes, I became more and more involved in contesting. And there was a contest, I don't remember how often each year it was held, but it was called a CD party, communications department from the league. And I really enjoyed those contests. I did both. No, I don't know if I did phone, but I did mainly CW contesting in the CD parties. I did sweepstakes after that. I've always liked sweepstakes. People can complain that the exchange is too long. That never bothered me. I've gotten so, and I think I was a pretty good CW op way back then, but I can copy CW with no effort. I think I can copy CW better than I can copy speech.
I've heard that 40, 50 words a minute. That's pretty good if you're speaking that fast too. So let's go back just a little bit. I'm just curious. Do you have or did you have siblings, and were they interested in amateur radio? And your father with the radio store, did he ever show an interest in amateur radio?
No, he was never interested in getting a license or much interested in ham radio at all. And my sister was never at all interested. But my parents didn't discourage me. They supported me. Well, I was going to mention one of the things I built, when I was doing all that traffic handling from Springfield, I had built a better rig. I wasn't using a 6AG7 anymore, but I kind of designed a rig by taking pieces from different articles or different parts of the handbook. It had a VFO in it, and in between the VFO and the 6146s, well, originally they were 807s. I had a unit that came in the handbook. And in fact, come to think of it, it was also designed by W1TS Don Mick, who designed the 6AG7 crystal oscillator. It was called a bandbox, and it was a series of stages that were multipliers as you change bands. And the VFO was on 160, but I had problems with it drifting, and I ended up I built it into a separate little box that was mounted on that same chassis. It still drifted, and I think it was probably Roger W1WEF who suggested, instead of using that single bearing variable capacitor, use one with a double bearing, one on the back and one on the front. I did that, and it fixed the problem. It was like mechanical drift that, you couldn't see it or anything, but that was causing the drift in the VFO. So anyway, I finished building that transmitter and turned it on, and pop goes the 807s instantly. And I don't remember for sure if I tried another pair of 807s, which weren't cheap for it. I was still not working or anything. But my father checked the wiring. I checked the wiring. I wired it exactly as it was shown in a magazine called Radio News that my father used to get. And we couldn't find anything wrong with the wiring. So I asked Roger if he could take a look and see if he could figure out what was going on. And it took him about 2 minutes. And he said, I see the problem. That's the screen grid and the control grid pins are reversed. They had them wrong on the schematic in the magazine, and that cost me 807s. So when I rebuilt it, I rebuilt with 6146s, and it turned out to be a pretty good rig.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. When you went to the University of Massachusetts, what did you study?
Electrical engineering, of course.
Well, of course, but I just want to make sure. I wanted to hear it from your lips. With a partial degree in amateur radio from the Amateur Radio Club. So where did it go after that? I mean, when you graduated from college as an electrical engineer, what did you start to do? Did you stay in the area?
No, I accepted a job at Sperry Gyroscope on Long Island, and I was in a radar systems group that had just finished testing and building a big Navy radar system. And I remember all the big honchos went to fire it up one night, and they beamed it at the moon, and they got signals back from the moon. And boy, that was the talk of the office the next day. It was fantastic, bouncing signals off the moon. Now I have a friend who does it from his house with a lot less than a gigawatt or whatever they were running. And as you know, a lot of hams are bouncing signals off the moon.
Right. The WSJTS software with the digital mode seems to make that so much easier than it used to be.
Right. You can't even hear the signal.
Did you ever do moon bounce at home? Was that ever a...
No, I never was interested in it. I wasn't really in on that moon bounce at Spirit. It was the higher ups that got to go there for that event. I had just started there, but after 6 months there, my dad passed away, and I decided to go back to Springfield and help my mother out. And I saw an ad from Pratt & Whitney Aircraft in New York City that they were interviewing, and I ended up being hired at Pratt & Whitney in an electronic instrumentation group that was involved with the development of engines, not production or manufacturing. And it turned out that the work that I did there was really diversified, from designing a connector adapter to data acquisition systems and control systems and anything in between, anything that would come up that was needed. And I designed a monitor scope that was used for monitoring strain gauge data. The monitors, there were 48 monitor scopes in a van that was driven up to the test stand, and there would be a guy actually sitting there watching the signals on the scopes during a engine run, and he could signal the operator to shut down if he saw too much stress. And we ended up building 500 of those scopes. That was the most of. We never built that many of anything in this little group that I was in.
Now, Pratt & Whitney was in Springfield or close by?
No, it was in East Hartford, so it was a 20-mile drive for me. So anyway, while I was at Pratt & Whitney, I became interested in skiing, and I met my wife on the slopes. At the time, I was running a ski lodge for a single ski club, the Hartford area, and I was up at the Killington ski area in Vermont every weekend. We booked the lodge solid every weekend. It was myself and a good buddy of mine who was running it, which meant that we took reservations. We bought the food. We had a catered supper on Saturday night that I remember was really good, and it cost $1.50 a head. But I skied Killington for years, and then after meeting my wife and we got married in 1966, I thought we shouldn't be running this singles club ski lodge anymore. My wife and I did run it for 1 year, and I happened to cross a little farmhouse for sale in a neighboring town. I bought that house so we could still go up and ski and have a place to stay. We brought up our kids on skis from about 5 years old, and we were very avid skiers. My wife and I, before we had kids, both skied Mount Washington together, the highest mountain in New England, and actually the third highest east of the Mississippi, with the highest being in North Carolina. But you had to hike up carrying skis and boots and overnight stuff if you're staying overnight on the mountain, which I did a few times. My wife only did Mount Washington once with me. The place he skied there was called Tuckerman's Ravine, and I did it about 5 times, the other 4 times before we were married. But even though I had a house in Vermont, all of our vacations were in Colorado or out west, where the snow was always better. I got to tell you my favorite story in my working years. I mentioned that I was involved with a control system. Well, it was a control system designed to experimentally set a schedule for the vane angles in the compressor to vary as a function of speed. And Pratt & Whitney built an actual engine in a competition for the engines for the C-5A transport plane. And it was one of the most powerful engines ever built. I think it was 40,000 pounds of thrust. And we ran the engine, and everything was working great on it. So anyway, back to skiing. My wife and I are on top of Aspen Mountain, and there's Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, waxing his skis. And I went up to him and I said, "Would you mind if I take your picture?" And he said, "Sure, go ahead." So I took his picture, from 2 feet away, nice close up. Went back to Connecticut after our vacation, and weeks later, I get word that Robert McNamara is going to come to the test stand to see our engine and need to be there in case anything happened to our system during the demonstration of our engine. So I was there early in the morning, and we didn't know what time he'd be there for sure. And we got word that he's in the plant, and the excitement is. And in my pocket, I had that picture that I had taken of him, and he would be coming through with the president of Pratt & Whitney and the CEO of United Technologies, and I was going to give him a picture in front of these two guys that I never even saw before. I never got close to them. Well, it turns out he never even came to the test stand to see the engine because he had already decided that GE was going to get the contract. But we turned that engine into the engine for the Boeing 747, and we sold over 1,500 engines. The C-5A only had there were over 1,500 planes built, and the C-5A only had 150 or so. So we ended up maybe better off, I don't know, maybe with what the government paid for the engines, it made up for the other 1,500 planes. But anyway, that was an interesting experience.
How did your ham radio life parallel your professional life? Were you always an active ham?
No, there was a hiatus when I got married. I was actually inactive for about 17 years. And when I got back into ham radio in 1978, I had no idea what kind of radio to get. What prompted me to get back on the air was I had to have an operation for a hernia. And in those days, well, the human relations guy that covered our area told me that he was out for a month with a hernia operation. So I figured, well, I guess I'll be out for a month. This would be a good time to take up ham radio again. I called the league and asked someone I spoke to there, what should I get for a radio? And he suggested a Kenwood 520S. And by the time I went back to work a month later, I had worked all states and DXCC. And starting at that time, I became interested in chasing DX. And I would be up in the middle of the night. I followed all the DX bulletins to find out who's going where and when there was a new country to work. And once I got I have every entity. I've worked them all, including North Korea. And I was never interested in working them all on each band and keeping records of what I needed. I got them all mixed, phone and CW, and I was satisfied with that. So I was more interested after that in contesting, and I worked DX contests as well as domestic contests. And now my favorite contest is the 1 hour long CW Ops contest that's on Wednesdays. It's actually, it runs 4 times each Wednesday. I only do 2 of the sessions. Once in a while I do the third one, but first one is at 9 a.m. local time. The next one's at 3 in the afternoon. The next one's at 11 p.m. And I seldom do the 11 at night one anymore. But I really enjoy that because it's turned into a real high-speed contest. And I like high-speed CW. I can read 50 words a minute in my head, but there's no way I can put it on paper. I might be able to get a call down, but there's maybe one guy in this CWT, the CW Ops contest, does 50 words a minute, but I do an average 38 words a minute. And I really enjoy high-speed CW, and I enjoy running, which means that I call CQ and I just let everybody call me. And I seldom search and pounce in that contest. But I end up usually in the top 10 of those guys that are using one radio. I can't compete with the guys that use two radios, and more power to them. I just never felt like making the effort to learn how to use two radios. It was too much like work.
I was never a contester, but I've been around, I don't know, since, 70, 74, I think. No, it's my understanding that in order to confirm all of these DX contacts, for example, you actually had to have QSL cards, right, from all of the entities that you worked, including North Korea, if you worked North Korea. So were you able to actually get all of the cards and be able to, I guess, submit those to the ARRL or whoever the contest entity was in order to get the paper?
Yeah, I had to get the QSLs, and I did have one from North Korea. I had one from North Korea, but our house burned down in 2014, and the North Korea card went with the house. It was on a bulletin board by Ham Shack. We ended up building, by the way, in the same exact location. My tower and antennas were fine, but the coax was burned. And we ended up with a nicer house than we had before. The original house was a fixer-upper that we bought a year after we got married, and it was really a fixer-upper. I had to replace the asbestos siding on the outside. It wasn't insulated with hardly anything for insulation, so I tore all the walls down on the inside and insulated and put new walls up. I built an addition onto the house that doubled the size of it. At that time, I wasn't active in ham radio when I did that construction work. In fact, I'm not even sure my wife knew I was a ham when we got married. But when our house burned down, it was almost a blessing, because although I enjoyed building very much, and that, you might say, was another hobby of mine, I didn't do as good a job as the guys who built the new house for us, the real builders. And we love the house we have. But it turned out that although our house, when I bought it, was only the fourth or fifth one on our 2-mile long road, the location was fantastic. It later turned out that the land behind us turned into state forest because the owner of the land couldn't build on it. There was too much ledge out there, and I don't remember if it was donated or what. And that allowed me to have antennas at my property line into the state forest. And it turned out the location was just great. And I had 4 acres originally when I bought that, so I could put up any kind of antennas I wanted, but I never had more than one tower. And on that one tower at one time, I had 3 tri-banders and 2 40-meter beams. The tower was 108 feet high, but I've downsized now to one tri-bander on top and one 40-meter antenna on top. And right now I just have a high wire dipole on 80 meters and an inverted L on 160 meters. And, I do fine with them. I enjoyed CW and contesting as much as ever.
It seems to me that given the 70-plus years that you've been a ham, you've had a chance to go from a ham radio service that had 2 operating modes, CW and voice, and then maybe CW, AM, and single sideband. In all those years, have you tried any of the other modes? Have you been attracted to maybe trying the digital modes or RTTY or any of the stuff that...
No, I have to admit that I guess I might say that the digital modes, the digital technology, and today's technology has passed me by, because I never really was that interested in making a contact in 15 seconds on FT8 or half the time on FT4, and not being able to really converse with anybody or exchange enough information to make a contact. I guess they're holding digital contests now somehow with some kind of exchange, but I was never really attracted to try any of those other modes.
How about like RTTY or slow scan television or any of those things? I guess those probably would have been popular when you were in the 17-year hiatus, right? I think the early 70s, late 60s.
Yeah, actually, prior to me getting back on in the late 70s, I used to go to coffee with a guy at work every afternoon. We take a coffee break, and he was on slow scan. So he talked about ham radio a lot to me, and that kind of got me interested in getting back in. One thing I forgot to mention, I mentioned a hobby of mine was building, and in addition to building an addition on our house that doubled the size, I built a house in Vermont. That little farmhouse I bought was in the corner of a 1 acre lot, and I was able to subdivide the lot into two lots, and I built a house that I designed, and with the help of my wife carrying lumber, I built it single-handedly, except for the masonry work. I did all the plumbing, the wiring, the framing. I had some help on the roof, but I often thought I'd like to go back and see what that house is like now. I'd like to tour the inside because I can't even remember exactly what the inside was like.
Well, you might be able to go on Zillow or I think one of these real estate places if it's ever come up for sale. There's some interior and exterior pictures. I've actually found that kind of fun to look at the childhood houses 50, 60 years ago to see what they look like now.
I actually did look on Zillow and it wasn't there.
Oh, really?
I can't remember the number on the street. It was near the end of the street, but I'm thinking of taking a trip maybe this fall up that way and meeting my son who lives further north than that in Vermont. And my wife and I can stay overnight someplace and take a look at that house, among other things, and visit the Killington ski area again.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Did you build a Ham Radio Workbench and are you using it to either home brew or repair any projects?
Yeah, I've done a few little things at my station in Connecticut. I'm at my summer house now. I don't know if I mentioned that. We spent 5 months on Cape Cod in Massachusetts and the rest of the year in Connecticut. That's where my real station is. I have a station here with a 60-foot tower, a TH6 tri-bander on top, and 2-element 40-meter wire beam. And this year I didn't bother to put an 80-meter antenna up of any kind because last year when I had one, I didn't use it the whole year. So the 40-meter antenna used to be in front of the house and the 80-meter antenna was in back of the house. But my wife decided she didn't like the coax coming down in the middle of her garden in front of the house. And I had to agree with her. So I rearranged the antennas. And with the wire beam that I ended up with, it seems to be better than the dipole that I originally had. I just added a director to it.
So a wire beam is a stationary antenna, right? It's just pointed in one direction?
It's pointed west, where I work most of my stations in the CWT contest.
I see. Across America.
Right. Another hobby that we had, you could call it a hobby, two others. After I retired, we bought a used RV and we traveled across the country, coast to coast. During the winter, during the New England winter, we traveled in the southern half of the country and we really enjoyed RVing. The first year we did it, we went away for 6 months and then it got progressively less. and partly because I would come back to Connecticut to operate in the ARRL DX contest in February. And then we would go out again after the contest and head south again for maybe another month or so. But we enjoyed seeing the whole country that way and seeing a lot more than we ever would have with any other way than RVing. And I had 3 RVs and put 180,000 miles on in 15 years of RVing before we kind of got, I think my wife got tired of it before I did, more than I did, because we keep going to the same campgrounds and I'd been there before, been there and done that. So we stopped RVing.
Let me ask, with regard to RVing, did you take ham radio along with you? I mean, were you an operating, and did you run into other hams along the way, or did you rely on some ham radio hospitality when you were in the South?
So on every trip, I visited a ham somewhere, and I did operate. I remember having a 930S Kenwood rig, and I had a Hustler 6B TV that I could set up in 10 minutes, and it broke down and went into the storage compartment on the back of the RV. And that worked out great. I got on every day from the road pretty much and saw the difference in propagation from different parts of the country. One contact I'll never forget was working ZL2GQ in New Zealand on 80 meters of the shore in Alabama from the RV. You know, I only ran 100 watts in the RV, but that was a pretty good haul. That reminds me of another contact I got to tell you about. My most memorable contact of all time. I was in a DX contest and I worked VQ9QM. Something sounds wrong about that call, but it was Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And the operator was W4QM Dale Streeter, who I knew. And I worked him on 40 meters. It was 3 p.m, broad daylight. And I said, Dale, let's try 80 meters, move to 35-25 or something. So we went there, and to my surprise, that was a long haul for daylight on 80 meters. And sure enough, we copied each other. And I said, let's try 160, 1825. And we went there and we worked on 1825, which was amazing for broad daylight. It's a good haul for any time, but that was one of the best contacts I ever had.
You mentioned that you had done a lot of cruising, lots of cruising on cruise ships. Did you ever have an opportunity to operate ham radio from a cruise ship? And did you ever investigate, if you didn't, why you didn't?
Well, I remember on the first cruise I went on, and we never cruised before I retired, but we went on 40 cruises after retiring. On the first cruise, I asked the captain if I could see the radio room. He said, what radio room? We don't have a radio room. I never really asked if I could operate, but I remember talking to W1JR, who had operated on a cruise ship, and he brought a radio with a small whip antenna, and he got permission to operate. And I remember he told me he made one contact. So I don't know why he only made one. I would think that being out on the salt water like that, you ought to be able to do pretty well, but he couldn't put up much of an antenna. So I never did operate from a cruise ship. And what I miss mostly about cruising is the food.
Yeah, I've heard this before as well. There's an unlimited food and unlimited opportunities to eat food on a cruise ship.
Yeah, I thought we had really good food, and I enjoyed that.
It seems to me, I think I read on your QRZ page that you had operated 10 years, I guess, at Curacao. How did you end up working from Curacao, and what happened there?
Well, I was in the CW, what the heck was it called? Connecticut Wireless Association Club in Connecticut, where I met John Thompson, W1BIH, and we became pretty good friends. I used to do antenna work for him, fixing his antennas, forming his towers. And he invited me to Curacao, where he had a house and where they spent the winter. And I operated both CW and phone ARRL contests from there, which were in February. And I operated both with John as multi-single, and I did a couple, 2 or 3 single up by myself. And we always came in the top 2 or 3 in the world from there, multi-single anyway. And I think when I operated myself, I came in the top 2 or 3. So John thought that was the best. He once said he thinks he found the best place to operate from in the world. And that's where PJ2T is now.
Right.
Jeff Howard bought the place and put up a lot of better antennas and made terrific improvements to the place. I see Jeff from Dayton every year, and he brings me up to date on what's going on there. But we actually were in Curacao a couple times on cruises since I operated there, and I rented a car once and went and looked at the place, and I saw what he had done with it. He wasn't there at the time, and it happened that he had rented it to a couple of Swedish hams who were just about to leave for the airport. So they offered to show me inside, and I didn't want to hold them up from getting to the airport. So I saw the outside anyway. But it was nice to see the place again. I really enjoyed their hospitality, and it was great operating from there.
Does your wife, has she become a ham radio operator in all this time, or she just has a healthy respect for it?
And no interest at all in becoming one, but couldn't be more encouraging. She encourages me to buy whatever I want, go to any convention I want. She couldn't be more supportive in any way.
Some people would say that's amazing. I guess for the listeners who heard last time that I'd gotten rid of the IC 7300, well, a new IC 7300 arrived today, and that I wasn't going to buy it, but my wife says, you sure miss it. You should have it. So, I think it took me all of 5 seconds to place the order, and she says, oh, you should have it. And, happily it's unpacked and it's sitting here on the operating console, and I'm very happy about it. Anyway, I'm enjoying this very much. One of the things I wanted to ask you is because obviously ham radio has changed. Well, just like everything else in the world has changed. I think we're your generation and then mine. I'm a late boomer. You're an early boomer, but you've seen technology advance by leaps and bounds, and I think we're almost AI and everything. I can't imagine that we're far from warp drive at some point soon. What do you think has probably been the most memorable change for you in amateur radio from the beginning until now?
Well, in the beginning, I had a separate receiver and a separate transmitter. And you called CQ on one frequency, and then you tuned all over the bands to see if anybody answered you. And it took some time. The person calling you would keep calling for a minute or so, and if you were lucky, you found them. But when I got back into ham radio after that hiatus, everything was transceiver, and no one was, maybe some people used Collins gear now or something and have a separate radio and transmitter. But probably the biggest advance I see, I use a 7610 now, and I've had 7300s, and they're amazing. So you couldn't have a better radio to start out with, and I don't know who would buy a used radio anything less than a 7300, because over here they're more reasonable than what you paid over there. But the 7610, I don't know anything more that I would want in a radio than what I have in this. The biggest feature that's outstanding to me is the filtering. If I have QRM, I just turn the filter knob and it's gone. I'd go to a narrower filter, and I usually operate with 350 hertz, but sometimes somebody moves in so close that I've even gone down to 150, and then I don't hear the other guy at all, and I can still work stations on my frequency.
Do you use the spectrum scope? Do you like the spectrum scope?
Oh, I love it. I use it all the time. When I'm looking for a frequency to operate on, I can see where there's a hole. I I look at the scope for where the signals are. I look at the signals. I don't look at the water, what I consider to be the waterfall underneath the spikes for the signals. I don't hardly look at them. I just look at where the activity is by seeing the signals.
I think that's what I was missing the most about getting rid of the 7300 and then not having the spectral display. I'm thinking, how could I go back to, flying blind?
Well, let me just tell you something else that's changed since the early days is logging. To use paper logs, and in some contests, I had to keep taping on an additional piece of paper for like the German stations or the Japanese stations because I didn't have enough room on the paper to write the calls down. And dupe checking was just looking at the paper and see if you saw the guy's call. And then now it's all done, as you know, by computer. And as far as I'm concerned, N1MM is like the first AI. That program is so intelligent that I don't, and Tom and his group are always making improvements, and I don't know. All I use is a fraction of what that program can do.
But you use it for logging all your contacts.
Yeah, I use N1MM for general logging as well as logging, but I don't always log the general contacts. If I ever rag chew with someone, I don't always bring up N1MM and put them in the log. I use LOTW. That's another major, fantastic improvement in ham radio, being able to just send your logs in and have them cross-checked and qualified for awards at the league. I volunteered at the league for 9 years in DXCC, working in there, and I really enjoyed going in. I could go in whenever I wanted. I could stay with as long as I wanted. I could wander around and talk to people as much.
And was that interesting?
Yeah, I liked it. What I did mainly was double check what when the girls entered somebody's QSLs into the computer files, I double checked to make sure they were entered correctly. Sometimes I guess I checked the cards directly, but I didn't spend 8 hours there at a time. I'd spend 2 or 3 hours.
Are you concerned that younger people aren't joining the hobby, kind of like the way we did when we were young?
Well, if you really want my opinion, I think it's a lost cause. I know a lot of people who do everything they can to try to attract young people, but when I started in 1952, it was only barely over 50 years since Marconi made his first contact. And there was still a lot of excitement and history about radio. Now it's 75 years later, and I don't think the same interest or amazement is there that we still had in 1950 with being able to make a contact over the radio. I just don't see enough young people getting into it, no matter how hard people try. They're into other things.
Yeah, now I'm beginning to have. Maybe I'm beginning to think the same way that you're thinking in terms of whether or not. I love ham radio, and all of us who are in it, absolutely love it. We're smitten by it. We love the technology and all that stuff. But I guess I'm trying to figure out where my concern was. And I guess my concern was that young people were not becoming technical enough to fix their own stuff on the one hand. On the other hand, now I'm looking at, when you have a lot of time, especially if you're ill, you spend a lot of time on YouTube. And there's a lot of young people doing some pretty fantastic technical things that may not be around amateur radio, but, whether it's woodworking or building, like you're talking about, house building and things like this, drone building, all kinds of stuff, that maybe that there is that group of people that would have been hams are doing other things. And so maybe if we're worried about the priests of high technology disappearing into the ether and the world being stuck with systems they can't control, I'm not sure necessarily maybe it's not as big a problem as I thought it was. What do you think about that?
Well, I've been slowly getting through a book 2 inches thick on Elon Musk. And something he's really concerned about is that AI is going to lead to replacement of humans doing anything. That eventually robots or whatever they're going to be called will replace us. But yeah, I don't see young people getting into what we still enjoy so much in ham radio, even though they're higher technologies.
There are, yeah, I guess there are, but it doesn't have the same fascination. On the one, and I think maybe you're right. It's a picture of the times when, as kids, I mean, I started with a crystal set too, and just the idea that I could extract that information out of the air and into my, earphones at the time was pretty amazing. And well, it's still amazing. I mean, maybe that's the problem is that even though I know how it works, it's still pretty amazing and enjoyable. So I guess we're just part of the buggy whip generation who will go back to the old, quote unquote, old rigs in order to have that sense of warm nostalgia that perhaps was the highlight of our youth.
Yeah, it's still a thrill for me, not knowing who's going to answer me and being surprised by some rare call coming back or a new multiplier in a contest. And you just don't know where your signal is going. And actually, that's another fantastic thing that exists now is the RBN network. You can see where your signal is going without working anyone. You can call CQ, and this only works on CW, but see where you're being heard all around the world on any given band that you want to check it on.
Well, I've been playing with PSK Reporter, which is listening to the FT8 signals that I can hear from my inverted V antenna, and I'm blown away what I hear on 20 meters. Every continent, New Zealand, Australia, of course, Europe is very close, and so it's packed. But if I look over a 24-hour period, I see North America, I see South America. I'm not seeing a lot of Africa, but I'm assuming it's because there's not a lot of Africans on the air, perhaps on FT8. There's a few, but not a lot. But what I thought really the most fascinating thing is that this antenna that I have here somehow is able to hear signals, even though they're way down in the mud, but they're recoverable enough to be able to report them to PSK reporters. So I'm finding that aspect of the digital modes in terms of just looking at antenna performance is quite surprising. And I'm actually thinking about tearing the whole thing down. It's not a very good arrangement, but it looks to me like it's a pretty good arrangement, and I just have to see how it works on other modes, non-digital modes. Anyway, Jack, this has been, I knew we went back and forth a little bit in order to get you to come on the QSO Today podcast. I know you've been a listener for quite some time, and I so appreciate it. But I really appreciate that you joined me on the QSO Today podcast. And with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the QSO 73. I've really enjoyed it.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope you enjoyed this QSO with Jack. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W1WEF in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.